Welcome everyone to this session of the educationals on the Irish State and Revolution. I can't even remember what number we're on, but we are dealing with the two-party states, so Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, their history and I suppose what it means for the working class to have that kind of two-party state that we've had for the last 100 years. So. It's going to be the usual format. James will speak for about 20 minutes or so, then we'll open it up to questions and answers and discussion, and the start of the meeting will be recorded, so James's talk will be recorded for our YouTube series, but the discussion will not be recorded. So James, if you want to take it away.
I suppose the question of how Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have held on to power for so long is, I mean, you see people produce memes, people have the Einstein quote, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over and expecting different results. And some people actually despair of themselves and other working class people. They say, oh, what are the Irish people like? Or the Irish people are sheep. Oh, they always vote the same people in. So it's actually quite an important argument, as to what are the reasons that these two parties have dominated politics. And the reason the talk is called the two-party state, or the chapter in the book is called the two-party state, because if you look at states like North Korea, where you have a one-party state, I mean, Ireland, for all purposes, was really a one-party state, but the ruling class party divided itself into two wings, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. So, I mean, the talk is called the two-party state, but for all intents and purposes, it could have been a one-party state. And I want to explain how there's similarities between both parties, but how historically their origins were slightly different, and why did Ireland end up with two right-wing parties dominating politics, as opposed to places like, say France or Sweden, where, in Sweden, the Conservative Party, the Blue Party, are the party of the wealthy, and people look to the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats often don't deliver, but people look to the Social Democrats as a party of the working class. So you've got a left-right divide in the political spectrum. And that's something that's happening in Ireland over the last few years. You're starting to see a left-right divide emerge. But for decades, Irish politics was dominated by the right. I suppose I want to start with an example from my own life and own experience. My grandmother was an instinctive socialist, and grown up in Fatima Mansions, she had a very clear sense of sharing and stuff like that. But her consciousness and her understanding of Irish politics was very contradictory, because at the same time as being a very sharing and caring and honest working class person, she voted for Gay Mitchell from Fine Gael. And she voted for Gay Mitchell from Fine Gael for the same reason that a lot of people in marginalised and poor communities vote for mainstream politicians, because the people who starve you and put you on your knees are often the people you have to go beg to get whatever little scraps you can. And so actually a lot of the working class mothers would go and beg at the feet of these right-wing politicians, whether it was on housing issues, to get their access to a medical card, for whatever crumbs they could get. And so it's an ironical situation, really, that under capitalism, the ruling class politicians who disenfranchise you and disempower you are often the people you have to go to beg for the crumbs, because they've taken everything else away from you. So that kind of clientelist aspect to Irish politics is one part of the explanation. But I mean, I think it runs deeper than that. The hold that Fianna Fáil particularly had over the working class, I think, needs a deeper explanation. And we have to go back to the origins of the Irish state, as we've done in a lot of these talks, and go back to partition and the formation of the Irish state. As I've said before, the Irish state wasn't founded by wasn't founded by the revolution. It wasn't founded by people like James Connolly and the people who went into the GPO. In fact, the Irish state was founded by upper class people like Kevin O'Higgins, the millionaire William Cosgrave, these very wealthy elite people who explicitly stated they wanted to bring the revolution, the era of social flux, to an end. So these elite people formed the Irish state and explicitly formed it as a counter-revolutionary state, as a way to keep back the tide of the working class and the tide of protest, and push the working class back. And so when the state was formed, the party that would go on to become Fine Gael, Cumann na Gael, who would be one of the key components of the future Fine Gael. Cumann na Gael were the party of establishment counter-revolution. So Fine Gael had their origins as a political party, first in the National Liberation Movement, but in the upper class wing of the National Liberation Movement, those who wanted to get rid of the British, but wanted to keep a connection with the British Empire and also maintain their hold over the factories and the slums and their hold over the working class. And so Fine Gael were really, Cumann na Gael that would go on to become Fine Gael, were really the party of counter-revolution. And Cumann na Gael in power, the early years of the Cumann na Gael government, they executed 77 Republicans without trial. There was, they at one point, their forces, tied people to a railway track and blew it up. I mean, there was a huge level of brutality in pushing back a revolution. As I've said before, it's like the more the working class and the more grassroots protest movements push forward, the more force it takes to push them back. And so actually the strength of the revolution explains the horrors of the counter-revolution, the revenge the church took on working class and poor people, the extent to which they jailed children and brutalized women is understandable if you understand revolution and counter-revolution as a pendulum, that the further the revolution swung one way, the more force they had to lash back at us with to enforce the counter-revolution. And so when things started to become normalized after the Civil War, where one side of the ruling class, Cumann na Gael, were pro-treaty and wanted to maintain links with England, not just because of ideology or because they were pro-British, but because actually the wealthy farmers who were the kind of real class base of Cumann na Gael and would go on to become the class base of Fine Gael, they wanted to trade their agricultural products with the British Empire. And so it was in their economic interests to sign the treaty. So it was actually in their class interests. And then the forces who opposed the treaty were made up of small shopkeepers, people who were tied to smaller Irish businesses and more middle layers who had an interest in actually protectionist policies that would shut the country off from the British Empire and protect their small businesses from the bigger British businesses and the encroachment of British products into Ireland. And so actually underneath the Civil War, underneath all the kind of ideological and the battle of ideas that was going on, the two sides in the Civil War both had different strategies for how to run Ireland after the War of Independence. So Cumann na Gael, who would go on to become Fine Gael, their strategy was to sell agricultural products to Britain and to maintain a link with Britain. And so they were pro-Commonwealth, pro-links with Britain. The smaller kind of shopkeepers, publicans, the people that would form the class basis of Fianna Fáil, when Fianna Fáil was formed out of the anti-treaty forces, they were more inclined to protectionist policies, to shutting the Irish economy off and protecting their businesses from British products. And so there was an economic basis to the division between these parties. When things began to become normalized, when the Civil War settled down and when they moved from kind of military operations to evict people from occupied workplaces to more kind of standard policing, the kind of standard policing and normalization, although I say normalization in quotes because Ireland was never a normal society in terms of the amount of oppression that was used to hold people down. But I mean normalization in terms of that there wasn't the wholesale violence that was being applied during the Civil War. That kind of calmed down in the 20s and 30s. But there were some in the ranks of Cumann na Gael who were very unhappy at losing their privileged position and who were very unhappy that weakening the machinery of power would actually unleash further protests. And so factions of the ruling class in Ireland, people like Eoin O'Duffy, the Garda Commissioner, went and formed the Blue Shirts, that were an explicitly far-right movement that opposed protests by farmhands, helped the farmers to beat up farmhands when farmhands protested. So they were a counter-revolutionary. They wanted to continue the counter-revolution. They wanted to keep pushing the counter-revolution, whereas the main body of the Irish ruling class wanted to move to a more a normalization of the mechanisms of control. But in the end, Cumann na Gael, the blue shirts, the far right blue shirts, and a big farmers' party united to form Fine Gael. So you could see that in origin, Fine Gael is actually constituted from some of the most establishment people in Irish politics, but also some of the most counter-revolutionary and far-right people in Irish politics, despite in later years Fine Gael going on to say that they were something of an opposition to Fianna Fáil and to the establishment. So let's move on to Fianna Fáil. Fianna Fáil, come into office in 1932. When Fianna Fáil first went into the Dáil in the late 20s, after the Civil War, because they were so afraid, the Civil War had been so heated and there'd been, so many executions and stuff like that. Fianna Fáil really had a radical reputation. These were the anti-treaty guys. They were seen in some quarters as the guys who kept the fight going. And so people thought, some in the IRA ranks thought that when De Valera got into power, that the IRA members would be freed from jail, and they'd finally push back the Cumann na Gael, the establishment would be pushed back. But actually, De Valera, once in power, was every bit as brutal as the Fine Gael crowd who'd come before him. In fact, De Valera bought up the press so that he had an influence over people's hearts and minds. De Valera, had a tight relationship with Archbishop McQuaid, who helped him to write the Constitution, and the mechanisms of control were secured. And after De Valera had, taken on the blue shirt movement, the far right movement, squashed the blue shirt movement, people thought that was an indication that he was to some extent progressive. But once he dealt with the far right, he then turned his fire on the IRA, and some of De Valera's former comrades ended up imprisoned in the Curragh camp, and then the Irish state was normalised, which then creates a dilemma for Fine Gael, because if you think about it, Fianna Fáil had a reputation of being radical because they were anti-treaty. They were seen as, to some extent, the way Sinn Féin are seen today. They were seen as a radical opposition to the establishment, but a nationalist radical opposition to the establishment. Fianna Fáil were by no means anti-capitalist. They were no means against the system. They just wanted to run it a different way to the people in Fine Gael. They had a different orientation in terms of the British Empire, where Fine Gael wanted to trade their cattle with the British Empire. Fianna Fáil wanted protectionist policies that would develop small Irish businesses into big Irish businesses. And so they had different tactics for how to run capitalism, but Fianna Fáil by no means had any problem with running capitalism. They wanted to run capitalism. They were the voice of aspiring Irish exploiters and capitalists and landlords, a new layer of Irish exploiters, capitalists and landlords. But De Valera did do something very smart. He stole the Labour Party's thunder, and he built housing estates in the 30s and 40s, and a lot of the big housing estates like Crumlin, the foundations for those estates were laid down in those decades. But again, Fianna Fáil did it to establish a lot of their cronies. Companies like Cement Roadstone, what would go on to become Cement Roadstone, have their foundation in that period because they were hired to do a lot of the building, and so Fianna Fáil set themselves up as, we're radical, we're a national movement, we stand up to the British Empire, but we also deliver on housing, and we deliver on the needs of the working class. And so you ended up with a very peculiar situation where the main body of poorer working class people in Ireland actually voted for Fianna Fáil because Fianna Fáil seemed to be delivering on the economic side of things in terms of housing. And whenever anything went wrong, Fianna Fáil just blamed the British Empire. Unemployment's rising, it's the Brits, it's their fault. And there's a grain of truth in that Ireland was very underdeveloped coming out from under the thumb of the British Empire. But not everything that was wrong in Ireland in the 20s, 30s and 40s, not everything could be blamed on the British Empire. And the Irish ruling class became very adept at wrapping themselves in the tricolour and trying to hide their own failings and the inequality that they were creating, because they were the capitalists now and they were the slum landlords, but they could hide that inequality underneath nationalist rhetoric by pointing to the British Empire. And so Fianna Fáil built themselves as a national movement, a movement that was, for all intents and purposes, it was really a movement of the Irish capitalists. They were the A team of the Irish capitalist class. But unlike the capitalists in Britain or the capitalists in Sweden, where they had their Tory parties and the workers had their Labour parties, Fianna Fáil was the party of the working class in Ireland. And so it was more equivalent to, you know, something like Peronism in Argentina, where you had a right-wing movement that had working class support. And imperialism then allows this right-wing movement posed as being more radical than it actually is. And so the dilemma for Fine Gael then was, if Fianna Fáil have won over the working class with these economic reforms, and if Fianna Fáil is the party that has a relationship with the church and the developers and the capitalists on one hand, but can keep the working class quiet on the other, through nationalist rhetoric and through delivering on certain economic reforms and certain things like housing, stealing the Labour Party's thunder, then Fine Gael had a problem. Fine Gael had been the most counter-revolutionary party in Ireland, but what did they do now in opposition? What do you do in opposition? And so by the time 40s, 50s and into the 60s rolls around, Fine Gael become adept at trying to present themselves as an oppositional force, you know, that they're not an establishment force. Secretly, they're the most rabidly, you know, pro-empire, you know, people jokingly call Fine Gael West Brits, but I mean, their point of view has always been that kind of the most conservative point of view in the most conservative point of view in Ireland. And so you have Fine Gael to some extent go into coalition, for example, in the first inter-party government with National Labour, Clan na Public, you know, some of the parties that were seen as left-wing would go into coalition with Fine Gael, even though Fine Gael was a conservative party, a party of free enterprise, a party of the system. But Fine Gael had to some extent present themselves as an opposition to the establishment, which had coalesced around Fianna Fáil. But this system starts to break down in the 1960s, when there was huge amounts of working class struggle. And I'll talk about the breakdown of this system in the 60s before kind of talking about the breakdown again after the bank bailout. These are the two kind of final points after talking about how these parties established themselves. In the 1960s, there was 1.5 million strike days lost by the end of the 1960s. In the last year of the 1960s, Charles McCarthy, who was like the Jack O'Connor of his day, one of the key union leaders, said, oh, Jesus, you know, if we're not careful, we'll have a conflagration, we'll have class conflict like they've seen in May 68 in Paris. And Jesus, we don't want that on the streets of Ireland, you know, because Irish union leaders are very conservative. And we were very concerned that people might continue protesting and striking. They wanted to keep that, keep a tab on that and keep it back. But what happened was that, you know, Fianna Fáil during that election campaign, during the election campaign in the late 60s, revealed themselves as conservative because they started going on about Labour is for Stalin and Labour is for burning homesteads in County Meath, and they were really panicked by this rise in militancy. The Labour Party went up to having thousands of branches across the country, 15,000 members, you know, there was an explosion. And people were saying that the 70s will be socialist. In other words, that the Labour Party was going to lead the working class to socialism. But the Labour Party never challenged Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael during the War of Independence. They never capitalised on the revolution. They never represented the politics of Connolly, that you would use the War of Independence, the Irish Revolution, to keep fighting and push forward the interests of the working class in a post-independence Ireland. They never opposed partition, you know, the dismemberment of the working class, and they allowed Fianna Fáil to steal a lot of their policies and then win over the working class by using Labour Party politics, because Labour were always too scared of protest and too obsessed with Parliament to actually do what needed to be done to challenge the establishment. And so Labour at the end of the 60s says, we'll never go into coalition with Fine Gael. Fine Gael are a party of free enterprise. But because of their reformist politics, because Labour were obsessed with trying to reform Irish capitalism rather than challenging it, they go into coalition with Fine Gael in 1973. And the Fine Gael Labour coalition of 73 to 77 destroys the working class. You know, we all saw it, you know, 10 years ago, Joan Burton kicking lone parents in the face and taking the low-hanging fruit to implement austerity and demoralising the working class because Labour betrayed them. I mean, the government of 73 to 77 did the same thing. And what happens? Fianna Fáil get back in with one of the biggest votes ever recorded for any political party in European history, because people were so disgusted with what the Labour Party had done. And so one of the key aspects of understanding the hold of the right over Irish politics, why these two right-wing parties that emerged from the Civil War and had two different strategies for exploiting the Irish people, why was it that those two parties were able to dominate for so long? One of the key things to understand is the failure of the politics of reforming Irish capitalism, the politics of the Labour Party, the politics that obsesses about parliamentary arithmetic and obsesses about going into coalition with various parties of the right, rather than obsessing about empowering the Irish working class, the true agent of change. The only people who can truly challenge the establishment are the Irish working class, and Labour has never had faith in the Irish working class. We saw the same thing after the bank bailout. I mean, during the 80s, Haughey could talk about people having to pull their belts in while he bought himself an island, leading up to the Industrial Relations Act and the tying of the hands of the Irish unions, where Thatcher had to fight the unions tooth and nail to destroy the miners and destroy union rights. In Ireland, the union leaders went and said, here, please tie our hands. And so that led to wage suppression, the growth of the Celtic Tiger, the orgy of speculation and finance and the property bubble that then collapsed in 2008, 2009. And again, there came an opportunity to challenge the establishment. I mean, the vote for the establishment parties, the vote for Fianna Fáil collapsed, after the first wave of austerity. But to some extent, right-wing voters or more upper-class voters swung from Fianna Fáil over to Fine Gael. That's understandable. But working class voters who'd, up until that point, a lot of them, didn't trust the Labour Party because of every era the Labour Party would let you down. You get the surge of Labour in the 60s, they let people down. You get Dick Spring, the Spring Tide, then they let people down. They go in with, Fine Gael, and then they were alternately in with Fianna Fáil. They went back and forth between the two during that period, during Spring's time in government. And then you had the Gilmore Gael after the first wave of austerity. People put their faith in Labour again. But then Gilmore, Joan Burton and these people get back in, and then they kick working class people with another round of austerity. And so the majority of working class people say to themselves, well, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are parties of the establishment and they don't represent us. But every time we vote for Labour, every time we vote for the left, what people think is the left, the reformist left or the Labour Party left, every time we vote for that left, they kick us too. And so what you see is a growing percentage of people who just don't vote. And to be honest, I'd rather people voted tactically. I'd rather people voted. I think, it's a good thing to vote. It's a good thing to use your vote and exercise your right to vote. But I can understand why the working class in this country, a certain section of them, are apathetic, considering all the major parties and the role the major parties have played. Which brings us up to today. And I think one of the reasons we've seen the ruling class embrace repeal, embrace marriage equality, and embrace the progressive values that a lot of working class people have, because working class people want the country modernised. You look at the repeal vote and you look at the marriage equality vote, there was huge votes in the poorest estates, showing that the working class are ahead of the establishment in terms of modernisation and moving this country forward. But Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael embraced those values reluctantly. They themselves don't agree with those values. The protests by Fianna Fáil TDs against choice, holding up placards with big no on it, to try and pressurise Micheál Martin to stop him from embracing any kind of modernisation. That just shows that the establishment were weakened after the bank bailout. Their votes collapsed. First Fianna Fáil and then Fine Gael after they implemented austerity with the Labour Party. Their votes collapsed, and so they had to embrace repeal. They did it reluctantly. They did it against their will. They embraced marriage equality and repeal to try and shore up their vote. And so instead of actually understanding that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have been a two-party monolith or two sides of a right-wing bloc that have ruled this country for decades, we have to understand that there were opportunities, there were breaches in the walls, there were breaches in their defences. There were times when they were weak, like the end of the 60s. There were times when they could have been finished off. But parties like the Labour Party, parties that wanted to run Irish capitalism instead of transforming Irish capitalism and transforming the system in the interest of working class people, are fighting for socialism. Those parties demoralise people and then give the right a new lease of life. And so in the 1980s, the right-wing establishment parties could get 85% of all votes. Imagine that in any country. You know, it's like something, from North Korea, you know, where you always get 100% of the vote. You know, it's that kind of domination. But in the last election, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael only got 43% of the vote. And that's huge progress. If you think about it, there are about 30% of people in this country who are comfortable. And there's about 70% of people, you know, people who might be, you know, self-employed, or, you know, electricians, plumbers, working class people of every description. You know, the 70% of us who are, you know, will never own a house, who are, you know, hard done by the system. But there's 30% of people at the top who like the tax haven economy and have an income that's dependent on the tax haven economy. Well, you would expect that the ruling class parties would get 30% of the vote. But if they got 43% of the vote, that means they're only getting their own class plus a small chunk of the people. Isn't that to some extent a reason to be cheerful, like a reason to actually celebrate the fact that they're starting to lose their hold over the working class? They still have some hold over white collar workers and people who perceive themselves as culturally middle class, but are actually white collar workers. And they have to rely on establishment votes to get themselves in. And that's why they all scraped in at the 5th, 6th, 7th count. They could barely get in, and they only cobbled together a coalition with the Green Party, whose voters weren't expecting them to go in with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. So I think the establishment has been weakened. I think the two-party system has been weakened. But the final thing I want to say is that the lesson has to be learned. That if you go in and you try and run the system will run you. And so the lesson that the Labour Party never learned is a lesson that Sinn Féin haven't learned. In other words, Sinn Féin in the north, instead of challenging Stormont and challenging the system, have sat at the table with the people that they'd fought for years and years and years, and then had to implement austerity. And although as a socialist, I'll march alongside many Sinn Féin members and many Sinn members in many movements in the past and to come, we have to say that the Sinn Féin leaders, by saying that they're willing to sit down with Fianna Fáil or sit down with Fine Gael and sit down with the establishment and negotiate a government, well, I'm sorry, but the story will end the same way it ended for Labour. And so I think that's why we have to passionately articulate a politics that's about challenging the system in the name of empowering working class people, instead of allowing vulture funds to feast on the carcass of the Irish housing market. We have to put the wealth of this country in the hands of the people who produced the wealth of this country, and that's the working class. And that's why I think that discussions like this are really important, because we need to fight for a socialist Ireland. We can't just repeat the cycle again and again and again, see another party compromise with the establishment, and then have a period of demoralization to follow. We can't afford to do it. We can't afford to lose another generation or another cycle of struggle to the mistaken strategy of trying to negotiate or compromise with a rotten system.
Thanks very much, James. That's really great. That's a great talk. So we're going to open up to questions and answers in a minute. And obviously, before I do, just to say this has been organised by Rebel Telly and the Red Network. So if anyone's interested in getting involved, just get in touch with us. Details will be in the chat on how to get involved. So